share with you some discoveries I made that'll show you exactly how much the government is ripping you off. Step number one. What is CPI and why is it important? The CPI is a basket of goods and services measured by the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, BLS for short, and it measures food, housing, clothes, transportation, medical care, recreation, education, and a basket of smaller services like haircuts and tobacco. Why is this important? Because this adjusts Social Security payments, payments to government workers, military retirees, food stamps, GDP. Now the GDP isn't measured specifically from the CPI, but it's another measurement very similar that shows us the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP, which is adjusted for inflation. And of course, what we really care about is the real GDP. And something most people forget is that the CPI adjusts tax brackets. That is huge. More on that later. Also, it affects investments such as stocks, housing, or how we measure those investments. We always want to look at the S&P 500 adjusted for inflation. Same thing with housing and real wages. We want to know how much wages are going up, not in nominal terms, but in real terms, because that tells us the real purchasing power of the individuals. Step number two, how is the consumer price index measured today and how was it measured in the past? In the past, the consumer price index was measured as a cost of goods index. COGI is the acronym. And this was actually pretty simple. If you had a basket of goods that included toothpaste, a new car, and let's say filet mignon, and there is a reason I'm using that instead of steak. Let's say our tube of toothpaste goes from $2 to $2.20. The new car goes from $30,000 to $33,000. The filet mignon goes from $10 to $11. Well, we can do the simple math here, and our CPI would increase by 10%. Pretty straightforward. Coming over here, the way it's adjusted now, though, and this is really where it gets crazy, and you can start to see the scam coming through. It's measured as a cost of living index. And you may say, well, George, that kind of sounds the same. Well, yeah, check this out. We've got a tube of toothpaste here, new car, filet mignon, the same items. But let's say that the cost of a tube of Crest toothpaste goes to $2.20, but the generic goes from $1.80 to $2. The way it's measured now is they come in and say, well, the consumer has an option that's still $2, so the price really hasn't gone up. Starting here with the new car, let's use a little bit different numbers to make the example crystal clear. Let's say they go from $30,000 to $60,000, so they double in price. But the way this is measured now, they include all of these adjustments for quality, which is completely subjective. So if they say that, yeah, the price has gone from $30,000 to $60,000, but the quality of that car has doubled, well, then the price is the same because the increase in quality is a counterbalance to the increase in price. The filet mignon, remember that's $11 over here, but let's say you could get a T-bone steak now for $10. And well, a steak's a steak, and the filet was $10 over here, and you can still get a steak for $10. So, of course, there's no price increase. So in this scenario, the CPI would have gone up by 0%. Although your Crest toothpaste has gone up by 10%, the cost of your car has doubled, and the filet that you enjoy once a week has increased by 10% as well. So what you see very quickly is this might be a cost of living index, but it's definitely not a quality of living index. Oh, but wait, there is more. In 1983, the Bureau of Labor Statistics started to omit the cost of buying a home. And they replaced that with the cost of renting a home. And what's the biggest expense that you have as a consumer? The cost of buying your home. So they've completely taken that out of the CPI calculation. Step number 3, to explain why the Consumer Price Index is the biggest scam in history. We're going to check out Shadow Stats, one of my favorite websites. If you guys haven't gone there, we'll put a link in the description below. We're going to look at the real CPI numbers versus the fake and phony government CPI numbers that we have today using 2 charts from Shadow Stats, 2 different methodologies. Methodology number 1 is measuring how the government themselves measured the CPI prior to 1990. So between 1990 and 1980. And the second methodology is how the government measured inflation of the CPI prior to 1980. And this is really important because this is when we had that big bout of stagflation that we're all so familiar with. In our first chart, this blue line represents how inflation was measured. This red line is how it's measured today. Right off the bat, we've got at least a 2% discrepancy, and throughout this entire chart, we've got an average of 2 to 4% difference between the way it was measured between 1990 and now. Moving down to the chart of how the CPI was measured prior to 1980, we start at the same, but we have a divergence in 1983. And throughout this chart, the difference between those 2 measurements is noticeably larger than it was even from 1980 to 1990. Bringing us to 2019, we see that if we measured inflation the way it was in the 70s, we'd be at a 10% inflation rate. But what the government is telling us, that there's nothing to see here, we're only at a 2% inflation rate. So you may be asking yourself, yeah, George, I know, but those are just charts, and this 2% a year, 3%, does that really make any difference? Let me answer those questions by giving you some real numbers using some line items from step number 1. Social Security payments. If you're getting $1,000 a month right now from your Social Security checks, if the government wouldn't have changed the way that they measure that CPI, you'd be getting $2,200 a month from your checks. GDP, which is how we measure how well the economy is doing. With the numbers that we have today, we've seen modest growth over the past decade. But if they wouldn't have changed the numbers, we would be in a depression over the last decade. Real wages, this really hits home to all of us. If you look at the wages of the middle class, with today's CPI numbers, they've pretty much stayed the same since 1980. But if you use the real numbers from Shadow Stats, we see that real wages have actually gone down dramatically since 1980. And if real wages have gone down dramatically, that means that your purchasing power has gone down dramatically as well. And if you're thinking to yourself, yeah, but this can't be right. I mean, the United States isn't in a depression right now. And yeah, I know real wages might be the same, but boy, they're definitely not getting lower. I think I'm going to go ahead and believe the way that the government is measuring CPI right now. I think that's right. But let's think about this. If you believe that, then you also have to believe that the government was overstating inflation in the 1970s. Because all of these measurements come from the government. This is the way that they measured it between 1980 and 1990. This is the way they measure it today. And this is the way it was measured in the 1970s. So it really becomes a binary decision. You either have to believe that they were overstating inflation in the 1970s and things weren't that bad, or you have to believe that they're understating inflation now. At the risk of being redundant, I want to further explain why this is a binary decision. You have to make a choice. Either you think that they overstated inflation in the 1970s, or you think that they are understating inflation now. This is the decade between 2010 and 2019, and the decade between 1970 and 1979, which of course the history books tell us that this decade was bad, it was horrible, absolutely miserable, and this decade was pretty good. It's been the largest expansion in U.S. history. In this decade, let's say that the inflation rate was 2.5% and the inflation rate in this decade was 10%. These aren't exact numbers, but I'm just using them for the example. So looking at the shadow stats numbers, we can see that if we measured inflation today the way we measured it in 1970s, our inflation rate today would be very similar, almost 10%, using these numbers as our hypothetical. And vice versa, if we measured inflation in the 1970s, the way that we measure inflation today, the inflation rate in the 70s would have been far lower at maybe 2.5%, very consistent with what it is today. So if you're someone that believes that inflation is measured correctly here, and throughout this decade things have been really good, then you have to believe that throughout the decade of the 1970s, things were absolutely phenomenal. And let me explain my rationale to you there. We know that wages went up in the 1970s. But as we know it today, inflation went up even higher. So the prices of goods and services went up faster than the rate of wages. That's why the misery index in 1970 was so high. But if we were to measure inflation in the 70s the way that we measure now, inflation would not have been near as high. So if inflation wasn't as high in the 1970s, but we know that wages nominally did go up, then there would have been a huge delta between wage growth and inflation, meaning people's purchasing power would have increased dramatically and everyone would have been getting richer. GDP throughout the 1970s would have also boomed. As a matter of fact, it probably would have been our greatest decade of growth in U.S. history, because it's just like wages, how we talked about them over here, where GDP went up nominally, but the history books tell us that inflation went up just as fast as GDP, so our nominal growth was pretty flat. So if inflation didn't go up as much, you have a huge amount of real GDP growth in the United States. And I also want to point out the fact that this proves, whichever side you're on, whichever you want to believe, it means government has been lying to you this whole entire time. Because they're telling us that in this decade things were good, in this decade things were bad. But we know that if we measured things the same way, if we kept a consistent ruler, that either things would have been good here and great in the 1970s, or things were bad in the 1970s and just as bad today. And before you decide which numbers that you're going to believe, I want you to ask yourself the question. Turn on the news and look at all the social unrest that we have in the United States and throughout the world. And look at the wealth gap. Look at how it's growing year after year. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and the middle class is getting a lot closer to the poor end of the scale than they are the rich end of the scale. And ask yourself if things are good now based on the numbers that the government is giving us, or are they bad now based on the numbers the government was giving us in the 1970s? Step number 4, why would the government change the consumer price index method? Number 1, it would lower payments to government workers, retirees, and to welfare recipients. Number 2, it would decrease the debt load of the United States. Remember that the debt of the U.S. is in nominal terms. So inflation eats away at the debt because you're paying that debt back with cheaper dollars. In other words, if inflation is really running at 10% and the government is saying that it's running at 2%, well, the Fed doesn't need to increase interest rates because we've got inflation under control. It's a Goldilocks economy, right? Not too hot, not too cold. So the US debt is at 22 trillion, the GDP is roughly 20 trillion, and let's say that the receipts, the revenue of the government is 3 trillion. To make things simple, let's assume that inflation runs so hot that the GDP goes from 20 trillion to 100 trillion. Now keep in mind, this doesn't improve your quality of life. You don't become richer. Your purchasing power doesn't increase because this gain is all inflation. In fact, your quality of living would actually go down. But the receipts that would be generated by the government would go from 3 trillion to 15 trillion, but the debt is nominal, so it still stays at 22 trillion. So if you have 15 trillion coming in to pay your debt, it's a lot easier and you can pay your debt a lot faster than if you only have 3 trillion coming in. And it boosts headline GDP. You guys know from watching my videos that the US economy is based on debt, asset prices, and confidence. If they can boost GDP artificially, or at least that headline number, what you see in the media, that keeps confidence high. If they weren't able to do that, and let's say that we measured CPI like we did in the 70s, and we've been in a depression for the last decade, or at least a recession, that would destroy confidence, which would destroy the economy. If you look at this holistically, you see that the government has every incentive to manipulate that CPI number and to make it lower than it actually is. And I haven't even talked about the huge bombshell discovery that I made while doing this research. That's how CPI affects tax brackets and how they're manipulating that to screw you even more. We're going to talk about that right now. Step number 5, tax brackets. And this in and of itself makes the consumer price index the biggest scam in history. Let me explain. Got tax brackets right now. Let's say our tax rate is 15%, 25%, 30%. And from $0 to $10,000 in this example, the tax rate's 15. From $11,000 to $50,000, it's 25. From $51,000 to $100,000 in income, it's 30%. Let's say that you're making $48,000 a year, and inflation goes up, the real rate of inflation goes up by 10%. But the government comes in and says, no way, it wasn't 10%. Our CPI shows 0. Inflation didn't go up at all. Well, in this scenario, your wages, your income would go up with the rate of inflation, so your income would go from $48,000 to $52,000. But remember, your income only went up with the rate of inflation. So even though your income increased, you can't buy any more goods and services because the cost of goods and services went up at the same rate as your income. Last year, you would have been taxed $7,200. And I know that these are marginal rates and not effective rates, but we'll just, for the sake of keeping things simple, we'll assume that it's the effective rate. So you're charged $7,200 on this $48,000 in income, leaving you $40.8 thousand. Now your income is $52,000, but you bumped up a tax bracket. So instead of paying 15% on the 48, you're paying 25% on the 52, which is $13,000. That leaves you with $39,000, a number lower than the $40.8 thousand that you would have had over here. But that's not all, because remember that the cost of goods and services actually went up. So your take-home pay in nominal terms actually goes down, but the cost of goods and services increases. So effectively, your purchasing power goes from $40.8 thousand all the way down to about $35,000. So the government gets richer. They get more of your tax money, and you get poorer. And the scam just got a lot bigger in 2018 with this new tax bill. We all look at the lowered rates and say, oh wow, that's great. But what people don't do is they don't read the fine print. And if you read the fine print per the Federal Reserve's own website, you'll see that the method that they used to calculate this CPI for the tax brackets changed again, and they're understating it even worse. So the difference between real inflation and what they're telling you has gotten even greater. And how that applies to the tax brackets is that's going to make your income stay the same in real terms, but your tax bracket is going to go up and up and up. This is a huge scam that nobody's talking about. And I've never asked you guys to do this before, but I really want you to share this video because I think it's crucial that Americans know what is happening to them and the wool that the government is trying to pull over their eyes by this type of nonsense. For more information just like this, check out this content right here, and I will see you on the next video.